Picture this: February 23rd, 1964. Daytona 500. Richard Petty crosses the finish line at 174.8 miles per hour, a full lap ahead of second place, not seconds, not car lengths, an entire lap. NASCAR officials stood there, jaws on the floor, watching Plymouth's new engine turn their premier race into a parade. By the end of that season, Chrysler's Hemi-powered cars would win 26 out of 62 races. The following year, 14 out of the first 15. NASCAR panicked so hard, they literally rewrote the rulebook overnight. This is the story of how one mechanic's impossible cylinder head design brought America's most popular racing series to its knees. The year was 1963, and Chrysler had a problem. Their wedge head engines were hitting a wall, literally an airflow wall. See, in a wedge head design, the valves sit at an angle in a chamber shaped like, well, a wedge. It's simple, cheap to manufacture, and works great for street cars. But when you're trying to move massive amounts of air at 7,000 RPM, that angled valve arrangement becomes a bottleneck. The air has to make sharp turns, creating turbulence that kills power. Ford was dominating NASCAR with their 427 mystery motor. General Motors had their legendary small blocks. And Chrysler? They were getting their doors blown off week after week. Tom Hoover knew exactly what was wrong. As Chrysler's lead engine developer, he'd spent countless hours on the flow bench, watching smoke trails reveal the ugly truth about wedge heads. The intake air would slam into the chamber wall, tumble chaotically, and lose velocity right when it needed it most. The exhaust gases faced the same problem in reverse, struggling to evacuate through ports that forced them into unnatural contours. In racing, where every horsepower counts, Chrysler was giving away 50 horses to bad airflow alone. But here's where it gets interesting. Hoover had been studying an old design that Chrysler had abandoned in 1958, the hemispherical combustion chamber. The concept wasn't new. It dated back to the early 1900s. Even Chrysler had used it in their firepower engines of the 1950s. But those engines were expensive to build, heavy, and honestly kind of a maintenance nightmare for regular folks. The accountants had killed them in favor of cheaper wedge designs. But Hoover wasn't thinking about accountants. He was thinking about humiliating Ford on Sunday afternoons. The beauty of a hemispherical chamber is almost poetic in its simplicity. Picture a perfect dome carved into the cylinder head. Now, place the spark plug dead center at the peak of that dome. The intake and exhaust valves sit opposite each other, angled outward like wings. When air enters through the intake valve, it flows in a smooth, natural arc across the dome and down into the cylinder. No sharp turns, no wall slamming, just pure, laminar flow. The exhaust follows an equally smooth path out. It's the difference between water flowing through a kinked garden hose versus a smooth pipe. Hoover pitched his idea to Chrysler's brass in early 1963. Their response was predictable. Too expensive, they said, too complex. The wedge is good enough. But Hoover had an ace up his sleeve. He'd been secretly working with a small team of engineers, including Bob Tarazzi and Dick Maxwell, to develop a proof of concept. They'd taken a 426 cubic inch RB block, Chrysler's biggest wedge motor, and topped it with experimental hemispherical heads. The initial dyno results were so shocking that the dynamometer operator thought his equipment was broken. Let me put those numbers in perspective. The best wedge head 426 was producing about 415 horsepower on a good day. Hoover's first experimental Hemi, 425 horsepower, and that was just the beginning. Within weeks, they were seeing 450, then 475. By the time they'd optimized the cam timing and intake manifolds, they were pushing past 500 horsepower, from the same displacement, the same basic block, just different heads. The accounting department suddenly became very interested. The technical specifications of the race Hemi were absolutely brutal for 1964. We're talking about an engine with a 12.5.1 compression ratio. The intake valves measured 2.25 inches across, bigger than a silver dollar. The exhaust valves were 1.94 inches. Compare that to the wedge engine's 2.08-inch intakes and 1.74-inch exhausts. That extra valve area meant the Hemi could move 15% more air at the same RPM. But it wasn't just about size. The valve angle was the real secret weapon. In a wedge head, the valves sit at about 18 to 23 degrees relative to the cylinder bore. They're fighting gravity and geometry with every stroke. The Hemi's valves were canted at 58 degrees, almost perpendicular to the piston. This meant several things. First, the valves could be larger without shrouding against the cylinder wall. Second, the ports could be straighter, reducing turbulence. Third, and this is the brilliant part, the combustion chamber could be more compact despite the larger valves, creating better flame propagation. The spark plug centered in the dome could ignite the mixture evenly in all directions. In a wedge head, the flame has to travel across an elongated chamber, losing intensity as it goes. The engineering team also incorporated something called porcupine valve arrangement. Looking down at the head, the valves weren't parallel. They were splayed outward like the quills on a porcupine's back. This allowed for even straighter ports and better packaging of the rocker arms. Speaking of rocker arms, the Hemi used a dual rocker shaft system. Each head had two parallel shafts, one for intake rockers, one for exhaust. This setup was more complex than a wedge head's single shaft, but it allowed for perfect valve train geometry even with those radical valve angles. Now here's where things get really clever. The Hemi's ports weren't just big. They were specifically shaped to maintain velocity. See, making ports bigger usually hurts low-end torque because the air moves too slowly at low RPM. Hoover's team used a technique called port velocity tuning. They made the ports progressively smaller as they approached the valve, accelerating the air like a nozzle. At 7,000 RPM, those ports were moving air at nearly 300 feet per second. The wedge heads? Lucky to hit 220. Chrysler knew they had something special, but they needed to test it in combat. They chose the 1964 Daytona 500 as their proving ground. It was a massive gamble. The Hemi had less than 6 months of development, no race history, no real durability testing beyond dyno runs. They were going up against Ford's proven 427s and Chevrolet's mystery motor, both of which had years of refinement. If the Hemi failed publicly at Daytona, it would be a marketing disaster. The qualifying sessions should have been NASCAR's first warning. Richard Petty's Plymouth hit 174.418 mph in qualifying. Paul Goldsmith's Hemi-powered Plymouth did 174.910. Jimmy Pardue, 174.280. The entire front row was Hemi-powered. Ford's fastest qualifier was back in 6th place, nearly 3 mph slower. But everyone assumed the Hemis were sacrificing reliability for speed. Surely these experimental engines would grenade themselves over 500 miles. Surely. Race day told a different story. Petty didn't just win, he dominated with surgical precision. His car was so much faster that he could run conservative lap times, save fuel, and still pull away from the field. When Ford drivers pushed hard to keep up, they'd overheat their tires and fall back. When they tried to draft, the Hemis would simply power away on the straights. By lap 50, it was clear this wasn't a race. It was an exhibition. Plymouth's team orders were simple. Don't race each other and make everyone else look stupid. The numbers from that 1964 season are almost comical. Hemi-powered cars won 26 races. They could have won more, but Chrysler actually told their drivers to ease up in some races to avoid a complete PR disaster for NASCAR. Think about that. They were so dominant they had to lose on purpose. Ford was livid. General Motors threatened to pull out entirely. Track promoters were panicking because fans were getting bored watching Plymouth and Dodge run away with everything. NASCAR's Bill France had a crisis on his hands. The Hemi was completely legal under the existing rules. It was a production-based engine. Chrysler was selling street versions, although only 11,000 of them in 1964. But the racing version was so superior that it was killing competition. France tried weight penalties first. Hemi cars had to carry an extra 250 pounds. Didn't matter. They still won. He tried restrictor plates at superspeedways. The Hemis just revved higher to compensate. Then came the nuclear option. For 1965, NASCAR announced that only engines available in regular production cars, meaning at least 500 units sold to the public, could race. But here's the kicker. The engine had to be available in mid-size cars that normal people actually bought. The race Hemi was only offered in full-size Plymouths and Dodges that year. It was a rule specifically designed to ban one engine. Chrysler's response? They pulled out of NASCAR entirely. The 1965 season was a disaster for NASCAR. With Chrysler gone, attendance plummeted. Richard Petty, the sport's biggest star, was sitting at home. Fans were furious. Track owners were losing money. By mid-season, France was desperate. He negotiated a compromise. Chrysler could return with the Hemi, but only in full-size cars and with weight penalties. Even with those restrictions, Plymouth and Dodge won 14 of the first 15 races they entered. Ford's response was to develop their own exotic engine, the 427 SOHC Cammer. But that's a whole other story of mutually assured destruction. Let's talk about why the Hemi was so utterly dominant. It wasn't just raw horsepower, although 550-plus horses in race trim certainly helped. It was the torque curve. The Hemi made usable power from 3,500 to 7,500 RPM, a power band so wide you could practically leave it in one gear. The wedge engines had a narrow sweet spot, around 5,500 to 6,500 RPM. Miss a shift by 200 RPM, and you'd fall off the power curve. The Hemi? It didn't care. It pulled like a freight train everywhere. The Hemi also had superior heat management. Those hemispherical chambers, with the spark plug centered in the dome, distributed heat evenly. Wedge heads would develop hot spots in the corners of the combustion chamber, leading to detonation under racing conditions. The Hemi could run more aggressive timing, higher compression, and leaner mixtures without grenading itself. In endurance races, this was the difference between winning and watching your engine scatter itself across the track. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect was how the Hemi scaled with modifications. Every improvement, bigger carbs, wilder cams, better headers, yielded proportionally more power than the same mods on a wedge engine. Why? Because the fundamental architecture could actually use the extra air and fuel. It was like the difference between forcing more water through a kinked hose versus simply using a bigger pipe. The wedge heads would hit a wall around 500 horsepower no matter what you did. The Hemi? Racers were getting 600-plus horsepower by 1966, and that was with 1960s technology. The development costs were staggering. Chrysler spent an estimated $15 million, that's $140 million in today's money, developing the race Hemi program between 1963 and 1965. They built special foundries just for the heads, created new machining processes for those angled valve seats, developed custom valve train geometry that had never been attempted at that scale. All for an engine that would sell maybe 11,000 street units total. From a pure business perspective, it made no sense. But from a marketing perspective, every win on Sunday translated to showroom traffic on Monday. The street. Hemi was a different animal from its race brother, but still revolutionary for a production car. It came with dual 4-barrel carburetors, radical 276 to 284 degree duration camshafts, and 10.25.1 compression. Rated at 425 horsepower, it was underrated for insurance purposes. Most made closer to 475 at the crank. The first street Hemis in 1966 came with a sticker price of $105 extra. That's $10,000 in today's money, just for the engine option. You could buy a whole second car for that. But people paid it. The street Hemi created its own problems. These engines required 100-plus octane fuel to run properly. They idled like paint shakers. The dual quads needed constant synchronization. Spark plugs fouled if you didn't run them hard regularly. The valve train needed adjustment every 3,000 miles. But Lord, when you matted the throttle, all those problems disappeared in a tsunami of torque that would literally twist the car's body structure. Chrysler had to reinforce the unibody cars just to handle the Hemi's violence. Here's something most people don't know. The Hemi almost killed itself through success. By 1967, insurance companies were refusing to cover Hemi cars for drivers under 25. The engines were too powerful for the primitive bias-ply tires of the era. Drivers would lose control and wrap them around telephone poles with alarming frequency. Chrysler sold just 1,011 street Hemis in 1967, down from 2,666 in 1966. The boardroom started asking uncomfortable questions about return on investment. The race program, however, continued to dominate. NASCAR kept adding restrictions, and Chrysler kept finding ways around them. Smaller carburetors. They developed better intake manifolds, weight penalties. They put their drivers on diets and drilled holes in non-critical components. By 1969, the Hemi was winning even with 300 pounds of ballast and restrictor plates. It was engineering stubbornness at its finest. But the real legacy of the Hemi wasn't in victories or sales numbers. It was in forcing the entire industry to evolve. Ford developed their 429 Boss series specifically to combat the Hemi. Chevrolet created the ZL1 427, an all-aluminum monster that cost more than the car it came in. The horsepower wars of the late 1960s, that was the Hemi's fault. Every manufacturer had to respond to Chrysler's hemispherical challenge. The technology trickle-down was even more significant. Those huge valves the Hemi pioneered? They became standard in performance engines. The porcupine valve arrangement, adopted by nearly everyone, high-flow ports with velocity tuning, that's in every modern engine. Even the concept of sacrificing low-end drivability for high RPM power became accepted in performance cars. Before the Hemi, muscle cars were expected to be tractable on the street. After? Radical cams and lumpy idles became badges of honor. Let's talk about the men behind this engine, because the Hemi wasn't just Tom Hoover's baby. Willem Weertman, Chrysler's chief engine engineer, fought the corporate battles that got it funded. He convinced Lynn Townsend, Chrysler's president, that racing success would transform their image from stodgy to exciting. Bob Tarazzi developed the valve train geometry that made those radical valve angles possible. Dick Maxwell figured out the port shapes that gave the Hemi its incredible airflow. These weren't just engineers. They were artists working in iron and aluminum. The testing program was brutal. They'd run engines at full throttle for 48 hours straight, tear them down, measure every component for wear, then redesign whatever showed weakness. Early versions would scatter connecting rods like confetti. The solution? Forged steel rods with bolts bigger than some engines' main bearings. The rocker arms would break at 7,000 RPM. The fix? Gun-drilled shafts for better oiling and reinforced rocker bodies. Every failure taught them something. One lesser-known fact, the Hemi's distinctive valve covers weren't just for show. Those massive chrome pieces actually served as oil control baffles. Under hard acceleration, oil would slosh away from the pickup, starving the engine. The valve covers had internal baffling that kept oil where it needed to be during 1.5 G acceleration. Form following function, but looking absolutely badass in the process. The Hemi even changed how NASCAR wrote rules. Before 1964, regulations were relatively simple. Displacement limits, stock body requirements, basic safety standards. After the Hemi dominated, NASCAR created complex formulas involving displacement, weight, valve sizes, and even combustion chamber shapes. They instituted the homologation rule, requiring 500 street versions. They created different rules for different tracks. The modern NASCAR rulebook, with its phone book thickness, that started with trying to contain the Hemi. By 1970, the party was ending. Emissions regulations were tightening. Insurance costs were astronomical. Gas prices were rising. The Clean Air Act meant that high-compression engines running on leaded gas were doomed. Chrysler built just 356 street Hemis in 1970 and 356 in 1971, the last year. The race engines continued in NASCAR until 1974, when the rules finally made them uncompetitive. An era was over. But here's the thing about legends: they don't really die. In 2003, Chrysler brought back the Hemi name with a new 5.7-liter engine. It wasn't a true hemispherical chamber. Emissions requirements made that impossible, but it had some of the character. By 2015, the Hellcat Hemi was making 707 horsepower from the factory. The Demon, 840 horsepower on pump gas. The modern Hemi might be different technology, but the spirit, overwhelming power that makes everything else look inadequate, remains the same. The original 426 Hemi's influence extends far beyond Chrysler. Modern Formula One engines use narrow valve angles and pent roof chambers that are evolutionary descendants of the Hemi concept. High-performance motorcycle engines almost universally use multi-valve heads with radial valve arrangements. Hemi DNA. Even economy cars benefit from the airflow research that the Hemi pioneered. Every time an engineer shapes a port for better flow, they're using principles that Tom Hoover proved in 1963. Today, original 426 Hemi cars are among the most valuable muscle cars in existence. A numbers-matching 1970 Plymouth Cuda with a Hemi can sell for over $2 million. Even a rough, needs-everything Hemi car commands six figures. There were only about 11,000 street Hemis ever built, and probably half are gone. The survivors are mechanical royalty, but it's not just about rarity, it's about owning the engine that literally forced NASCAR to rewrite its rules because nothing else could compete. The race shops that built these engines became legends themselves. Keith Black, who developed the aluminum Hemi blocks for drag racing. Dick Landy, who figured out how to make Hemis work in smaller, lighter cars. Sox and Martin, who dominated pro stock with Hemi-powered Plymouths. These weren't just mechanics. They were the high priests of horsepower, and the Hemi was their religion. Think about what one mechanic's crazy idea accomplished. Tom Hoover looked at a wedge head, said, "This is fundamentally wrong," and designed something that was so right it broke the sport. The Hemi didn't just win races, it forced an entire industry to evolve. It created legends, destroyed competitions, and rewrote rule books. It proved that sometimes the old ideas, like hemispherical combustion chambers from 1905, are old because they work, not because they're obsolete. Modern engineers, with all their computer simulations and computational fluid dynamics, still study the 426 Hemi. Why? Because it represents something pure, an engine designed without compromise, without focus groups, without emissions concerns. Just one question: how do we make maximum power from 426 cubic inches? The answer changed American automotive history forever. The Hemi proved that engineering excellence can't be contained by rules. You can add weight, restrict air, mandate specifications, but brilliance finds a way. It's a lesson that extends beyond engines, beyond racing, into any field where innovation meets regulation. The rules don't stop progress. They just channel it in unexpected directions. The Hemi didn't comply with NASCAR's vision of parity. It destroyed it, and in doing so, it forced everyone to get better. So the next time you see a modern Challenger or Charger with Hemi badges, remember what those four letters represent. Not just an engine design, but a moment when one company's engineering department declared war on the status quo, and won so decisively that the rules of engagement had to be rewritten. That's not just horsepower. That's history. What's the most dominant engine you've ever experienced? Drop a comment below, and share your story. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the engine that broke NASCAR, hit that subscribe button for more stories about the machines that changed the world. Until next time, keep those engines screaming.